Since it's October, I thought I could play some Halloween-y, scary horror games. Even though I am a horror aficionado when it comes to movies, I tend to not play that many horror games. This mostly boils down to a lot of them only relying on cheap jump scares and a lot of dark environments and little else, and to me that's just not what horror is about. But I don't want to turn this review into a diatribe about horror games. As you might have noticed, this year's theme is me only playing games with female protagonists, so I scrolled through my Steam library looking for female-led horror games. There aren't a lot in there, and Steam's user tag-based filter system also seems to include a bunch of questionable results. But while I was scrolling, my eye got caught on Phantasmagoria. I remember watching a let's play of Phantasmagoria 2, A Puzzle of Flesh by Spoony a few years ago. Holy shit, that was 13 years ago? I'm getting really fucking old. Anyway, that sudden reminder of possibly imminent death of natural causes notwithstanding, the name certainly stuck with me, and the campy full-motion video nature of the game made it very entertaining, especially with Spoony's aforementioned Let's Play that made it hilarious. So I was hoping to find something equally entertaining with its predecessor. As you may have already guessed, Phantasmagoria is a point-and-click adventure game. It was developed by Sierra Online, who were very prolific creators of adventure games back in the 90s. They're primarily known for the King's Quest, Space Quest, and Leisure Suit Larry franchises, but those mostly focused on your typical computer-generated imagery. Phantasmagoria was probably the largest project ever undertaken by Sierra, since it focused on integrating full-motion video into its cutscenes and interactive spaces. It might seem quaint these days, where every random YouTuber and Twitch streamer can hang up a green screen in their bedroom and chroma key themselves in real time, but back then this was quite a technological hurdle to tackle for such a game, and a lot of video games branded themselves as interactive movies. And you can see that this only really works halfway decently in Phantasmagoria. For one, the low resolution of the viewport meant that a lot of the artifacts from the chroma key isolation had to be kept around, otherwise it would look like half the actors' faces were missing if a pixel too much was removed. The more pressing issue, however, was the compositing. In order to insert a person convincingly into a CGI space, you have to make sure that the lighting and shading of the actors are consistent with the artificial lighting and shading of the scene you intend to put them in, which gets achieved with mixed results. But it's not just the compositing issue that makes the visual spectacle of the game rather underwhelming by modern standards. While most of the animated stuff happening during these scenes is mostly contained to the actors themselves, there are also a ton of backgrounds for these actors to move in front of. And apparently, Phantasmagoria was also decidedly extravagant in that regard, with the number of backgrounds reaching over 1,000 bespoke background images. Now, while that might sound impressive, sheer quantity isn't all that important if what you get to see isn't up to snuff. And while I can excuse some of the aspects of the early 3D pre-rendered backgrounds, I do have to say that much of it not only hasn't stood the test of time, it also must have looked equally goofy back in the day. It doesn't help that the game is mostly set in this giant manor that looks like a jumbled mess that the original owner probably designed themselves instead of hiring an actual architect. Sure, if these were actually real spaces, they'd certainly be impressive due to their sheer size, but there's not much going on in terms of environmental storytelling. Many of the rooms seem really sparsely furnished, given the fact that this is a massive and quite possibly very expensive mansion. There's also not much there to thematically tie all the spaces together. All in all, the visual portion of the game might have been a strong selling point back in the day, but as is so often the case, visual fidelity has a limited shelf life. And I'm not sure if Sierra's big investments into film production were that great of an idea, since games were never really lacking in decent storytelling capabilities, and the inclusion of live-action footage does nothing to enhance that. Besides, even the best tech in the world can't save a badly written story. And adventure games were and still are among the most story-driven games out there, so an adventure game having a bad story is pretty much a death knell for the entire enterprise from the word go. Phantasmagoria follows Adrian as she and her husband Dawn move into the manor that used to belong to a famous 19th century magician. She's a writer of popular literature who intends to get some inspiration from the mansion while he's a photographer. Soon after moving in, she's plagued by nightmares, and her waking up from one is where the game starts. There's not much of a setup for the story, you're basically just dumped into it and have to figure out yourself where it'll eventually lead. In fact, there's not much cluing you in as to what's going on or what you're supposed to do. The game is structured into 7 chapters. Now this is probably less due to the way the narrative is written and more due to the fact that they had to ship the game on 7 CDs, thanks to the, for the time, massive full-motion video files contained in it. Some of the chapters feel like they just start off and you're not given any clues as to what you're supposed to be doing. I'm glad that the game offers a hint system with this little skull on the bottom left of the screen. He doesn't outright tell you what to do, but he certainly certainly gives you pointers so you don't waste your time traveling across all of the 1,000 screens the game has to offer. But its inclusion also hints at a general problem of the narrative not being able to convey what you're supposed to do next. Anyway, once Adrian is done exploring the manor, she finds a hidden chapel that's located behind a bricked up fireplace for some reason. She unwittingly releases an ancient demon that was already the cause of the magician's demise a century earlier. Said demon now possesses her husband Don, who grows increasingly abusive and violent towards Adrian. He even ends up raping her at some points in a rather tasteless scene that seems to imply that her initial unwillingness turns into a consenting sexual encounter before becoming actual abuse again. Though the unconvincing and hammy acting turns what should be a traumatic event into a farce. I can't tell if it's the actor's fault or the shoddy direction, but a shocking number of scenes just seem barely above amateur dramatics level. It doesn't help that many of the sequences drag on forever, especially those that don't feature any interaction or dialogue between characters and are simply limited to Adrian reacting to something. Tons of these scenes just consist of her looking at something, making a face, and then awkwardly shuffling back into position to where her interactive counterpart would stand to make the transition between video and gameplay land look smooth. And every second of that process is on full, excruciating display. Did nobody watch this footage back and conclude that it just takes too damn long for Adrian to get back into position? While the game does offer a means to skip these sections, I was never quite sure if it's a great idea to do so, because as I said, the scenes go on forever, and I was never really certain if what I saw on a repeated click on an object or location would result in the same footage being played again, or if something new was happening that was worth paying attention to. I mean, it took me barely 6 hours to get through the game according to Steam's time tracker, and if you cut out all the needless padding, I'd call it criminally short. But you might be asking yourself now, wait a second, isn't this a point-and-click adventure game? Aren't there any puzzles to solve to complement the narrative? Well, yes, there are. It's just that in most of these instances, puzzle is a very generous term. Most of the time when you get an inventory item, it's immediately obvious where you're supposed to use it. Thankfully, Phantasmagoria doesn't employ the kind of moon logic that many of its adventure game ilk suffered from. But it goes a bit too far in the other direction and makes even the actual puzzles there are too easy. But I guess I shouldn't complain, since the fact that each chapter gives next to no exposition as to what's going on, the core puzzle of the game is figuring out what to do next, since the story doesn't really have any direction it wants to go into. Once Adrian releases the demon, not much happens besides Dawn being an increasingly abusive dick towards her, but there's not a lot of back and forth between the two until the final act. The rest of the time you're just going through the motions without much direction, and you just happen to get to see these visions from the past when that aforementioned possessed magician murders his wives in increasingly gruesome ways. They come entirely out of nowhere and don't really integrate with the rest of the game. It seems as if the designers wanted the game to mostly stand on its quote-unquote shocking and gruesome content, but to any seasoned horror fan it looks categorically quaint. See, using shock value and explicit content in lieu of a compelling and sensible narrative only works if you're also not trying to make a serious piece. And while there are a few goofy sequences in there, like Adrian dealing with two bumbling transients who live on her property, it's just too sparse and inconsistent to be taken as a farce and more an inept attempt to insert levity into a story that's more intent to be horrifying than anything else. The game does come alive in the last chapter when Dawn goes fully nuts and utters a bunch of solid gold lines like this.
A woman's body is a wonderful thing, but the head is useless.
But at that point you're already 90% done with the game, and all it can offer you after you deal with Dawn is an excruciating chase sequence with the now released demon where you have to do everything exactly right in order to banish him, or he kills you and you have to start off the entire sequence from the top. I can't really recommend Phantasmagoria, it just feels too meandering and directionless to serve as a good vessel to tell a story, and the gameplay is deliberately kept as simplistic as possible. The FMV nature, which typically adds a campy charm to the games that employ it, is its biggest weakness because of its glacial pacing. And to cap it off, it's really just not that scary, since it never managed to actually draw me into the story it's struggling to tell.